Good morning, students. Now that we're ready to start hand sanding our projects, there's a couple things we need to do before we start that process. First of all, if you do not have your name written on your project, remember, your name needs to be written on the back side. There's two reasons for that. First of all, to identify that it's your project, please make sure you write your class number on the back side. The other reason why that's important is that's going to let you remember which side is the back side of your project and which side is the front side of your project. Your name needs to be on the back side of every single piece that you make. That way, if it gets misplaced, we can identify that it's yours. The other reason that it's important is that we're going to be treating the front side of the project differently than the back side, and you'll learn about that in an upcoming demonstration video. Well, now that we're done with the machine sanding to change the shape and get it as accurately as possible, we're not going to be using the belt sander, the disc sander, or the spindle sander anymore on your project. Those were all done with very coarse grit, something like a 60 grit sandpaper. So that changed the shape really fast, but it didn't make it smooth. So what we're going to start doing today is we're going to start using the hand sandpaper to do the final sanding. Now, we try to have different colors of sandpaper so you'll recognize the different grits. And in the previous video, you learned that the grit is the measurement of how coarse the sandpaper is. The lower the number, the faster the sandpaper is going to sand. So we're going to start with the low numbers first. The machine sandpaper was something like a 60 grit, so we're going to have to start with the 80 grit first. Please remember that even when you're doing hand sanding, you do need to be wearing your safety glasses. So, the sanding blocks that we have at school look like this. It's a hard piece of rubber. It holds the sandpaper in place, but I can tell from the color that this is not the correct grit sandpaper. The red color at school is 120 grit. We need to start with the 80 grit. So I need to take the old sandpaper out. So what I do is I push my fingers and I lift this top flap. And if you notice, there are some sharp points inside the sanding pad. You need to unhook the sandpaper, and then you flip it over to the other side and you do the same thing. Open up the top pad, unhook the sandpaper, and now this sandpaper is still usable, so I can put it back in the bucket with the other 120 grit sandpaper. I'm going to do the 80 grit sandpaper. Now, we have different buckets for different grit sandpapers. In case there's no sandpaper of the grit that you need, you're going to have to come and ask your teacher for a new piece of sandpaper. They're going to give you a new piece of sandpaper, double check to make sure it's the right grit, and then you're going to have to cut your piece of sandpaper so it fits in your sanding pad. At school, we have these really cool sandpaper rippers, and the way you do it is you take the sandpaper sheet that your teacher gave you, and you put it with the abrasive down, and you slide it underneath the cutting blade, and you slide it all the way until it won't fit anymore. You hold your fingers on top of the cutting blade, and then you rip. Now, you've got one piece of sandpaper, but you have enough to cut yourself 4 pieces of sandpaper. So if you get a brand new sheet, you have to rip all 4 of the sheets of paper. Now, it would seem like that would be all you'd have to do, except when they designed these sanding blocks, if you use a full 1/4 of a sheet of sandpaper like this, the sandpaper is going to be loose when it goes into the sanding block. And it'll look something like this. When it's that loose, the sandpaper is going to rip way too easy. So what you're going to do is as soon as you rip your 4 sheets, you're going to slide one end of the sheets so it just barely sticks out on the other side. And then you're going to rip off about 1/2 of an inch off of all 4 of the sheets. That little scrap piece here is going to go in the garbage, but now my sheets are the right length to fit into my sanding block. So I'm going to put my other 80 grit sheets into the bucket so somebody else can use them. And then to put the new sheet into the sanding pad, you lift the flap and you slide the sandpaper in as far as it'll go, and then let that flap chomp down onto those sharp teeth. You wrap the sandpaper around so that the sandpaper is showing. Believe it or not, I've had students that put it on and they start sanding, and after 10 minutes they say, hey, my wood's not working right. So please make sure you're using the grit side of the sandpaper. And when you get to the other side, what I do is I pull it as tight as I can and I set it on the table, and then I lift up the other flap, tuck it in as far as it'll go, and then let the teeth grab onto the other side. And now I have a really tight piece of sandpaper that's ready to be used with a sanding block. For students who don't have a sanding block, you should have gotten a square sheet of paper that looks something like this. So you're going to find the 80 grit. And then what you can do is get a small square piece of wood. You should have a piece that looks something like this. And then what you can do is just fold the edges of the sandpaper along the edge of the wood. And then that can become your sanding block in order to sand your project. So now that I've got my sanding blocks ready, I'm going to put my safety glasses on. And now I'm going to make sure that I put my name facing down. That way I'm always looking at my finished side of my project. And the way I do it is I hang it over the side of the workbench, and I take my sandpaper and I'm going to hold it at a 90-degree angle, and I'm going to just start going around my project like this. And I'm going to have to keep spinning my project so that I can get it nice and round. Remember that sanding is probably the easiest way to make a difference between having just an average looking project and a really great looking project. Now, if you get to a spot where it's not as smooth as you want it to be, some of the pre-cut pieces have a funny notch in them, you're going to have to sand a little bit more in that one spot to try to get it to be more even. So, sanding is not a fast process. The more time you spend getting a really good job of making the shape accurate with the 80 grit sandpaper, the better it's going to be. Now, for the people who are working at home, please get your parent and guardian's permission on where they want you to do the sanding. And not only just so you don't damage any countertop or tables, but so that also you keep track of the fact that as you're sanding, you're going to make sawdust. And you are responsible for cleaning up your own mess. So, find out where you should go. Do your sanding with your sanding block. If you don't have a workbench, you can hold it in the air and you can sand that way also. You are going to get sawdust on your clothes, so please don't wear anything real expensive. And you're going to spend probably 20 to 30 minutes sanding to get all of the edges really smooth. Remember, that machine sander using 60 grit sandpaper is going to leave a lot of scratch marks that you need to get rid of with your 80 grit sandpaper. So, don't rush the project. Do your very best work. And show your teacher if you have any questions or any problems. But do your very best work getting started with the 80 grit sandpaper.